Hello, this is Dread, and in today's video topic, we are going to be covering a Bloody Nib Shatter Strike Spellblade. So, if you know me, you know that I'm a very busy person. I play a lot of builds in last Epoch, but even then, I still can't cover everything. So, I've done this series a few times now, but we're going to be doing another episode of the Hall of Fame series. That's right. This actually isn't my build this time. This is one of my viewers' builds. This is Cyborg's Bloody Nib Shatter Strike Spellblade, where we don't care about chunk, we just care about dealing as much damage as humanly possible. So, of course, Cyborg, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Cyborg Wars, and I've been playing this game for like 2 years now. I started this character like 3 weeks ago while leveling because I just wanted to make a Bloody Nib build because it's always been an interesting item for me, and it reminded me of the Aura of Decay, which everyone cries that it keeps killing them. So I wanted to see if I could make like this is a similar thing. I'm a mage enjoyer. I almost only play mage, and this was like a similar thing. I wanted to see if I could make something viable with it because I've never really seen a blood in the build before.
Yeah, that's
So
because
yeah,
we all assumed that Bloody Nib was bad on arrival because we thought the bleeds would actually kill you. In your experience, how does the downside feel? The hundreds of bleeds, right? How does that feel?
you don't feel it at all, honestly. As soon as you get the 75 physical resistance and you have the ward on hit nodes on the Shatter Strike node and the Spellblade nodes, you have way more than enough ward on hit to cover the bleed damage. Like it's not even close.
Yeah, it's like a very small tax. That's cool.
Yeah.
Would you ever consider running something like maybe like an Oracle amulet or something to reduce this damage, or do you feel like it just doesn't even matter?
I for sure thought about it, but I do think that other options are better. For example, at the very start, I played with Bleeding Heart actually because I didn't have the resistances and I didn't have the ward on hit, like the attack speed and just like the pure ward generation that I needed to cover the bleed entirely. So I was always running on very low ward, and in that case, I needed leech basically to keep me alive since I would otherwise it would dip into my health and something would hit me and I would just die. Um, an Oracle amulet could be nice, but honestly, I feel like either an Omnis or a Bleeding Heart are your best bet. The Bleeding Heart is nice because it also gives you the attack speed, um, and it just synergizes pretty nicely, I feel.
Okay. So if someone was to replicate this build, what would be quote unquote the buy-in to the build? Like what do you think would be required before you start playing something like this? Of course, other than
So
the bloody nib.
I would say for sure a two crystal swords with attack speed and flat crit. Basically, it doesn't have to be tier 7 or 6. It just needs to be like decent enough to where you can get decently high crit chance. Because Shatter Strike has this node on it that says it's called Steel, and it says you have more critical multiplier per sword, and it gives you 120 crit multi per sword equipped. So that's 240 crit multi just on one node. Um,
Yeah.
so it's very important that you're critting at least.
Speaking of crit chance, you
Uh,
actually have a peak of the mountain as well.
yes, I used to use a prismatic gaze when I was using a bleeding heart because obviously you can't leech with a peak over the mountain. But I slammed a good peak of the mountain, and I would rather use an Omnis than a Bleeding Heart. But those are both like, not the most friendly buy-in things to have
Yeah.
like a slammed peak and an Omnis.
Yeah.
But if you do, then go for it. It's a lot better damage-wise, and the Omnis will help you a ton with
Yeah, and we're
resistances.
peak of the mountain enjoyers here. That's
Hmm.
actually one of Spellblade's strongest things is being able to abuse peak like this,
Yep,
which is
I
nice.
agree.
Now, of course, you don't have it in the current footage that we're showing here, but I suggested a while back to maybe try using the ward on hit idols because currently you're
Mhm.
using like melee elemental damage idols and stuff like that, and
Yep.
you definitely don't need the damage, right? And I was thinking, well, you could use the ward on hit idols because that's like one of the strongest things about Shatter Strike, but you currently don't even have those, and you still look like you're generating enough ward. How do you feel generic tankiness? Like, how do you feel in monos and stuff?
So in monos, you definitely can't really just face tank stuff. With the flame ward setup, I think in the clips I sent you, I actually only have one charge in flame ward,
Yep.
but I usually run with two charges and the cast on stun node. Very important, super important actually, because anything can stun you, and if you're standing still, you're dead.
Yep.
Unless you have flame ward up, like
Yeah.
it's super important.
That's the
So
biggest problems with builds like this that generate their reward by doing actions instead of, just having a passive generation, right?
yep. So I would say it's fairly important, not like a must, and I didn't run this myself, to have cooldown reduction on your belt.
Yeah, so you
So
get the
that your
flame
flame
wards
ward
up.
is up
Yep.
as exactly. The flame ward is up longer, you can teleport more often, your enchant weapon is up more often. It's just really nice to have. You have a lot of cooldowns.
But yeah, I would heavily suggest anyone who wants to replicate this build though to look out for the ward on hit idols because they would juice up his, tankiness significantly.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But who cares when you're dealing this much damage? Am I right?
I'm a DPS enjoyer, yep. I like
It's
to
okay.
pump.
We're all DPS enjoyers here. All right.
Mhm.
So any like little tips that you have about the build? It's like after playing it,
Mm,
anything that wouldn't necessarily be like easy to understand when you first play?
so, okay, there is one bug, I guess, that I should maybe mention. If you look at my planner, like if you share my planner and you look at it, you might think this is weird that I'm specking into Frostclaw. So I spec into Frostclaw, and you take this the cast chance on melee hit node, right? That gives you
Mhm.
30% chance to cast Frostclaw on hit. Um, this actually only casts once normally per cast of Shatterstrike, even if you take the recast node. Like even if you're casting Shatterstrike 3 times technically, it only does it once. Like it doesn't care about the other two casts. But there's a really weird interaction with Bloody Nib specifically that makes it cast more for some reason. It will cast quite a bit more. I would say like triple, maybe quadruple the amount of Frost Claws. And now we don't use them for damage at all because we're not scaling spell damage. But
Yeah.
you have the Gift of Winter node, which can give you 12 mana with a 12% chance
Yeah.
on
And
Frost
that
Claw
gets
cast.
significantly better with the bug, right?
Exactly. It is noticeable, but it's not a must. Like I've played it with teleport Spectin instead, and it works just fine. Like you're
Yeah.
not that starved for mana. It's just kind of a quality of life thing because it's delayed mana. Like the Frostclaw procs are very delayed sometimes. So if you run out of mana killing something, you can't exactly mana strike to get your mana back. But then a few Frost Claws will pop off and you get like 20 mana. So you can use teleport or your Flame Ward can go off if something stuns you.
Yeah.
Um, so you're not on negative mana as much because of the
So
bug.
I'm noticing actually something through the clips here. You don't have a single speck of armor shred.
I don't. I
Ah,
don't.
oh my god, you
You're
could do
very
even
right.
more damage than what you're
I
doing here,
could.
about like
I could.
40% more. So if you're
Hmm.
a chat or I'm sorry, viewer, dear viewer, if you're watching this, make sure to get some armor shred on your crystal swords, as that will probably
Hmm.
increase your damage more. Although to be honest, to really be honest, it doesn't matter because the boss DR system will just get to you faster anyway.
Yep.
So to be out
The
like yeah,
reason
go ahead.
I don't have armor shred, sorry, is because I got these swords with tier 7 melee attack speed, these crystal swords with tier
Yeah,
7
and you
melee
Rune
attack
of
speed.
Creation them, right?
Exactly. I only
Yeah.
had like 3 FP left on it. I couldn't actually. I think it. Yeah, there's chance on shock with tier 3, and I didn't want to despair it, right? Like I'm not gonna
Yeah.
despair tier
Be
3 on
honest,
this
that's a
item.
that's even more of a pedigree of the build considering you don't even have armor shred.
Yep.
But yeah, you can get
True.
armor shred on the suffix of your gloves or your amulet or whatever.
Hmm.
Even a tier 1 affix would probably boost your damage up by like 20%. So
Oh
make sure
yeah.
you're looking out for that, dear viewer. Yeah, that's gonna be it for the interview today. Thank you, Cyborg, for giving me the opportunity to cover this build. It really does help a lot as I don't have the time to play every single build ever because generally I'm working on new builds and this is definitely a build that I knew about, but like and I knew that would work, but I just didn't have time to actually play it. So thank you for coming out, Cyborg.
No, not a problem. Thank you.
All right, we're gonna go in the planner myself, and I'm gonna explain more of the choices in detail. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, I'd heavily suggest leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel. With all that being said, let's go in planner, shall we? All right, here we are in planner with the build. Of course, like I said, I didn't play this build specifically, but he did give me his planner, so we can go around and talk about things in more detail. So for skills here, first skill, we take Shatter Strike. We take 2 points travel to Lingering Chill, although the global increased damage is great. 3 points into the Breath of the Cold, that more damage is wonderful and the area is great. Then 2 points into Whiteout, as it gives us extra recast, which makes it much more efficient to spam Shatter Strike, as we get our Shatter Strikes out much faster with this setup. And of course, 5 points into Ice Blink. This gives us an insane amount of attack speed, of course, with Shatter Strike, which showcases in the video, as you can see him spitting them out constantly. Then 2 points travel to Shiver, 4 points to Cold Steel. This gives you 120% crit multi per sword. This essentially solves all of your crit multi problems you'll ever need. To be honest, after this, you don't really need that much crit multi on all your gear or anything like that because it's per sword. And since you're dual wielding, you have 2 swords, so you get 240% crit multi from this node. Actual banger of a node. And of course, 5 points the mana efficiency, of course, because having less mana cast with our Shatter Strike means we can cast more Shatter Strikes, then eventually putting points to absolute zero if you have plus levels and stuff like that, because Shatter Strike has so much attack speed that you can afford to lose some attack speed for a gigantic amount of more damage. And of course, for other skills here, we have your stereotypical uh, mana strike setup just to give us all that extra mana, right? Technically, you could run critical rejuvenation if you're running out of crit, but I don't think you would be on this kind of build. One thing I would suggest myself is I wouldn't go for the global damage here. I would go for the mana when out of mana. That's like one thing I would do myself personally. But this other than that, this mana strike tree is really good. Frost Claw. Frost Claw's utility, literally you're just using it with Malcleudi and getting a chance to gain mana back as you're hitting so often with it. You'll gain mana back. Like Cyborg said in the intro, this is bugged, and for some reason, this is procking a lot more with the bleeds from like there's something going on with Bloody Nib procking this more. So, of course, take it with a grain of salt. Of course, you could like spec something else if it doesn't end up being useful after the bug's fixed, which whatever, right? The build will still function without the bug. Definitely, that's not a problem. And of course, enchant weapon, stereotypical enchant weapon tree, just grabbing all the melee attack speed, grabbing some melee flat damage, grabbing all the melee cold damage over here, of course, grabbing the minus mana cost, increased damage, and if you proc it when you're out of mana, you gain a lot of increased damage, and just enchant weapons, just of course your best in slot in this kind of build. And of course, Flame Ward. Flame Ward's just your stereotypical Flame Ward setup, not too crazy, just the usual setup. One thing I would suggest, instead of the Frost Ward here, I would suggest going for the free haste from uh, Flame Ward, but that's just me. And that's pretty much it for the skills. Now for the passives here, the important passives, just getting a bunch of attack and cast speed, of course, is great. Getting the free intelligence is, of course, great over here. Rune Master, the less damage taken is amazing. Eventually, Rune Word Cataclysm being built out would be amazing, as you get a bunch of free crit chance from it, as that'll help you cap your crit. Of course, over here, get a lot of damage, of course, getting the arcane shielding, stuff like that, the attack speed, the Volka's Razor, which is great. You don't really need blade weaving because you're not really like stacking up blade weaving stacks. The only thing I could ever think about suggesting for this build afterwards is filling into like stuff like menial fortitude for that more intelligence and the ward per second, because eventually you're going to want to start increasing the amount of ward and ward retention that you have to abuse all of the ward gain that you're going to have with this build. But that's pretty much it for passives. Now for gearing here, of course, he has a Peak of the Mountain. This is really strong for you as you don't really need the You don't really need the leech from crits because you're a ward build, right? He is using an Omnis as it helps him cap out all of his resistances very quickly, thanks to the fact he's running a Morning Frost setup with a dexterity. If you don't know, Shatter Strike actually gains 1 melee flat cold per dexterity, so he's actually double dipping on this dexterity and getting 120 uh, flat from this dexterity, meaning that he has a very, very large amount of flat damage. So he's running dexterity everywhere. So of course that helps out the Morning Frost and the Omnis here. For the weapon here, pretty much anything like this would help. Maybe you don't need all the space crit, but like essentially this is your best in slot sword, other than the fact that you might need to get some armor shred here, of course. Other than that, it's great. Chest here. Like generally just having armor, percent armor, and damage. The cold res helps too because of the Morning Frost, right? But overall, this is like pretty stereotypical chest for this setup. Of course, rings with percent damage, dexterity. Eventually, with this build, percent damage is going to be your limiting factor, as of course you're going to have everything else filled out. So eventually, having a bunch of percent damage everywhere is going to be great. The other ring here, some intelligence, some dexterity, some crit avoid to help you cap your crit avoid, of course. Belt here, he has tier 6 cooldown recovery speed, which is great. One thing that's cool about ward builds in general is the fact that your suffixes are a lot less useful, substantial, meaning that you can focus more on stuff like cooldown recovery speed, which helps builds like this function. Whereas gloves here, attack speed, dexterity, crit avoid, eventually cold and fizz res. That's actually kind of funny how these gloves ended up. And of course, the bloody nib. Bloody nib gives you a lot of mana regen, a lot of crit multi, a lot of dexterity, and a lot of penetration with Shatter Strike. He gets like well over 100% penetration easily with this build, which is a lot of penetration for a crit. And that's pretty much it for the build. Of course, he's running melee elemental idols, but eventually what you'd want to be using idols like a Throne of Ambition, and you also want to be using the 3x1 ward on hit idols as well, and that would make you significantly tankier in general. That would be one thing I would suggest, but he didn't have the time to be able to do that. So, with all that being said, this has been Dread. Thank you all for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you're at, and bye.